Hey, welcome to Sci Fi Secrets. So, this book is pretty appropriate considering the times. You'll see what I mean in a minute. This book was a bestseller in 1968 in France. But hey, it's a bestseller, right? Even if it's out of print now. Whoa, look at how much a paperback's worth. I have a hardcover. I bet it's worth at least $500 or. Oh. Okay, never mind. The Ice People is a book about Antarctic scientists who find the remnants of a civilization buried deep beneath the ice. When they date the ice covering the city, they get an age of 900,000 years old. Okay, now that I've told you all I can without major spoilers, it's that time again. But once again, this is an out-of-print book, so unless you want to buy a copy yourself, the spoilers may not matter. It's up to you. You have been warned. Now, if you know anything at all about human history, you will know that's not at all possible. The oldest human remains are no more than about 300,000 years old at the oldest estimates, and the oldest remnants of cities are only about 10,000 years old. And we have only been able to smelt metal for the last couple thousand. And yet the pieces of this city that remained had not what just seemed to be metal stairways in the deep sonar, but they were now detecting a signal from some piece of technology. Very faint and hard to detect, but it was there. But when the scientists dug down to them and tried to melt everything out of the ice, the objects melted with the ice. They had been down there so long that they had basically decayed to dust. The only thing that was keeping them together was the ice. And when the ice melted, they fell apart. But even below that, they found something in sand. Sand that should not be there. Inside this area of sand, they found an enormous gold sphere. The sphere was hollow, but it was also very hard, much harder than gold should be. They could not cut through it with any of their tools on hand. They had to send for a plasma laser cutter. They cut into the sphere and found a few things. One was that with the thickness of the sphere and with its size, it contained more gold than all of Earth's reserves had combined. The second was that it was not normal gold. It was organized in a way that not only made it very hard, it had to have been manufactured atom by atom. No natural process would have made such perfectly attached atoms in such a perfect lattice. These people had had the ability to transmute gold, and not just a few atoms for a great price like us, they had clearly mastered cheap transmutation on large scales. Inside the sphere, they found all kinds of shelves and machines, but at the slightest touch, everything inside the sphere fell to dust. The door opened onto a corridor several yards long. The floor was of gold, and the walls were of some porous-looking green substance. A blue door made of the same material blocked the end of the corridor. There were two other doors on the right hand and one on the left. Simon entered, followed first by Hoover and Higgins, and then by others. When he came to the first door, he stopped and pushed at it with his hand. His gloved hand sank into the door and went through it. Hoover muttered in surprise and tried to move closer. He was unintentionally crowding against Higgins, who, in order to keep his balance, backed against the wall. He went through it. He shouted, and the universal translator relayed his shout to everyone's earphones. There was a heavy thud a few yards away, and Higgins was silent. The shock had jarred the walls. They shook, visibly telescoped, folded in on themselves, and quietly collapsed into soft heaps of dust, revealing a dark chasm. The floodlights pierced the darkness, illuminating other walls which were falling noiselessly and disclosing a whole world in the act of dissolution. Objects, machines, unknown shapes all losing their forms, vanishing into themselves, falling in heaps into floors that crumbled in their turn. From the very base of the sphere, where all these amorphous masses were tumbling together, the thick gray wreaths of a cumulus cloud of dust arose. The scientists and technicians had barely time to see Higgins lying with his arms crossed, a golden stake driven through his chest. Then the cloud enveloped him and continued to mount. It created such a cloud that the scientists had to retreat and have the air vacuumed out. When they were finally able to return, there were only two things left to discover. The entire inner surface of the sphere was covered in microscopic writing in some unknown language. Then there was the egg, a smaller container made of the same gold inside the larger sphere. And from inside that egg came the signal they had detected on the surface. Inside that egg was a working piece of technology, a 900,000-year-old piece of technology. When they entered the egg, they found two humans, two of the most perfect specimens of humanity ever seen. When the world saw these images broadcast, every man had dreams of this woman, and every woman dreamed of this man. Many marriages were less happy afterwards, now that they had the image of human perfection to compare their spouses against. They looked towards the top of the egg, a room with a vaulted roof. Two long, narrow, golden pedestals rose from its floor, facing the stairway. Each of them supported a cube of a transparent material, similar to very clear ice. And inside of each of these cubes, a human being lay. The one to the left was a woman, the one to the right a man. They were naked. The man was tall and well-muscled. His erect penis rose like a plane climbing the sky. His clenched left fist was on his chest. The woman's legs were closed. Her hands lay, one on the other, just below her breasts. The slope of her flanks was like that of a dune molded by the wind's caress. Her thighs were round and long, and a fly's breath could not have made its way between them. The inconspicuous pubic triangle was composed of short, curly, golden ringlets. From her shoulders to her flower-like feet, each curve of her body was a note in a perfect harmony. Her face, like the man's, was covered by a golden helmet which stylized features of solemn beauty. The transparent substance that enveloped the man and the woman was so cold that the air around it turned liquid. It made runnels that decked the two cubes with a lacework that danced and broke and fell, evaporating before it could reach the floor. The figures lying inside these jewel boxes of shifting light were endowed by their very nakedness with a splendor of innocence. Their skin, with the smoothness and patina of polished stone, was the color of warm wood. Although the man's body was far less perfect than the woman's, it gave the same remarkable impression. Theirs was the youthfulness not of a man and a woman, but of the species. Slowly, Simon put out his hand, and all of the men who were watching the image of the woman on their television screens, who saw those soft, full shoulders, those round arms forming a basket for the graceful fruits that were the breasts, and the curve of those flanks in which the essential beauty of creation flowed. How many could prevent their hands from reaching out to touch that flesh? And of all the women who were watching that man, how many were tortured by the impossible desire to lower their bodies on his, to impale themselves on him, and to die there? In all the world, there was an instant of silence. Even the old and the children forgot to babble. Then the figures from square 612 vanished and normal life resumed, somewhat more irritated, more bitter than before. These two people were inside balls of perfect solid hydrogen. They were chilled down to absolute zero. Not a single one of their molecules had moved 1 picometer in the last 900,000 years. They were perfectly preserved, and with the recent advances in cryogenic hibernation, experts were sent for, in the hopes that they could be revived. The scientists debated on which to revive first. Eventually, it was decided to thaw the woman first. With surprising ease, she was revived, but she does not speak any known language, and she could not eat any food provided to her. She is repulsed by everything she tries, and when a tube is inserted to her stomach, she vomits up the broth given to her. Her body clearly cannot handle any modern food. Her system must be different than ours. Every supercomputer on the planet is set to work on deciphering her language. When they finally succeed, she is on the brink of starvation. They translate the words she had been repeating, and from eat machine. But everything in the sphere had turned to dust. They go back to the pods where the man is still frozen and find a compartment full of items. They bring her pictures of all the items and ask her which of them is the eat machine. Luckily, she is still coherent enough to let them know. When it is brought to her, she presses buttons on it and out pops small spheres. She puts them in her mouth and seems to let them melt. She keeps putting in different key combinations and different colored spheres come out. In a surprisingly short amount of time, she's revived back to her healthy self. Only now, they can talk to her with her deciphered language. She lets them know that there was a war going on when she went to sleep. She tells them of her strange and advanced culture and how they were at war with another group of people. Her people lived on what we now call the Antarctic continent. To her, it was Gondawa. Her people's enemy was Inosaur. Their continent was a much larger form of both North and South America. There was no narrow waste between the two continents back then, and it went further east, all the way to Greenland. So what happened? The third war lasted for an hour, Elia said. Then Inosaur was frightened. So were we, probably. The fighting stopped. 800 million people had been killed, the majority in Inosaur. The population of Gondawa was smaller and it was well protected in its shelters. But absolutely nothing was left on the surface of the continent. The survivors had to stay underground because the lethal radiation contaminated the surface. After the 1 hour war, the people of Gondawa remained underground. The shelters had proved their efficacy. In spite of the Treaty of Lampa, no one dared to hope that war would never break out again. Wisdom again suggested that this reconstruction be carried out in a safe place. The underground areas were dug down farther and also broadened. The work uncovered natural caverns, lakes, and rivers below the surface of the earth. The employment of universal energy made it possible to exert unlimited power that could take any form. It was used for recreation beneath the earth of a richer and more beautiful vegetation than had been destroyed above ground. In light equal to daylight, the buried cities became filled with flower beds and shrubs and forests. New species were brought into being, growing so quickly that the naked eye could observe the progress of a tree or a plant. Gentle, silent machinery made its way downward and laterally, causing earth and rock to vanish as it advanced. It leveled surfaces and left behind it polished ceilings and walls and floors that were harder than steel. The surface now was no longer a place to live, but it was put to good use. The small undamaged areas were cared for as preserves and equipped as recreation areas. In one place, an area of forest was repopulated with animals. Elsewhere, there might be a river that had stayed within its banks, a valley, an ocean beach. The new generation looked on surface expeditions as a great adventure. Underground, life was orderly, rational, and enjoyable. Everything that the people needed was produced by silent factories that produced no waste or pollution, and the basis of the distribution system was the key. After that, the Gondawan government wanted to have a weapon so powerful that the Inosaurians would be too terrified of it to ever attack Gondawa again. But the Inosaurians hear of it and launch an attack to prevent them from launching their weapon into orbit. The woman in the ice was Elia. Elia was not a politician or a warrior. She was just a young woman in love. Her life mate, Pycan, was more than a husband to her. He was her. They were one when they were together. Neither wanted anything more than the other. But everything in Gondawan society was determined by a computer. A perfect computer that could simulate any scenario, and it had decided that she was the most perfect candidate for the continuation of the species. The creator of the stasis pod was named Koban. He was the smartest man in Gondawa, and he believed that if the Gondawan government was able to launch their weapon, it would result in the end of all life on Earth. He tried as hard as he could to stop the two governments, even illegally contacting the leaders of Inosaur as well, but nobody would listen. The smaller country of Gondawa wanted the insurance of their weapon, and the larger, much more populous Inosaur wasn't willing to put their lives in the hands of their enemies. So all-out war broke out, and Inosaur attacked in an attempt to stop the launch of the superweapon. This made Koban ask the computer for the best male and best female candidates for saving the species after all life on Earth was wiped out. The computer chose Elia and himself. Koban sent for Elia and had her brought to the hibernation pod when the attack became imminent. But Elia, when told of the situation, decided she would rather die with Pycan than be the last woman alive. She accused Koban of just wanting a pretty girl for himself. He denies this, but she manages to escape. She gets back to Pycan, who has spoken with Koban. Pycan loves Elia. He doesn't want her to die. So after a last tender embrace on the shores of a lake, he knocks her unconscious and takes her back to Koban. She wakes up 900,000 years later. So Koban, the greatest mind to ever exist in the ultra-advanced Gondawa, is the frozen male. When this information reaches the world, the greed of men goes into action. Covert forces are sent to steal the vital information. The mathematical code that allows access to the universal energy that both Gondawa and Inosaur use to do their amazing things and create amazing devices is found on the interior wall of the gold sphere, and a plan is put into action to steal it and kill everyone that might already know it so as to monopolize it. In this process, a saboteur sets bombs in the Antarctic base, forcing everyone to evacuate. But Koban was just being warmed up. He was just now being revived, and his recovery was much more touch and go than Elia's had been. He needed a blood transfusion to get him stable enough to be evacuated. But humans had changed in the last 900,000 years, and the only blood on the entire planet that matched Koban's was Elia's. So they ask Elia if she would be willing to donate blood to the man that took her away from her love against her will. She agrees, but as the blood transfusion starts, while no one is looking, she slips a suicide pill into her mouth. She didn't want to live without Pycan, and she hated Koban for taking her away from him. One of the magical items that was found in the container with the Eat machine was 2 loops. They could transmit thought from one person to another. The team was using these to make sure that Koban was progressing normally through his awakening stages. But what Simon sees when Koban starts to come awake is a struggle he had had with Pycan after Elia was already entombed in ice. In a rage, Pycan had accidentally killed Koban and placed himself in the pod next to Elia. The man that Elia missed so badly was the one next to her for the last 900,000 years. The man she was now killing by poisoning the blood transfusion. Ah yes, the old Romeo and Juliet. Woman kills the man she loves on accident because she thought he was a scientist from 900,000 years ago. Wait, what? That's not how Romeo and Juliet goes? Sorry, I'm just trying to lighten the mood a bit. It's a very tragic ending and it kind of gets to me. So obviously what happened is Gondawa got its weapon into orbit and used it to destroy everything on the surface, including almost half of Inosaur itself, turning Inosaur into the North and South America that we know today, as well as widening the Atlantic. It also knocked the Earth off its axis, making the once tropical Gondawa into the South Pole, freezing it under ice for almost 1 million years. At the same time, Inosaur landed every one of their nuclear bombs on Gondawa, scouring the surface clean. But Koban, luckily, had been wrong. Life lived on, and became us, and found his little survival shelter, and dug it up where it had been entombed below the ice, unable to detect the conditions that would have made it open up on its own. Koban had thought this would take a few hundred years at most. Instead, this machine had worked for almost 1 million years, and still only detected ice outside due to the change in Earth's polar axis. After they both die, Elia and Pycan are placed back in their icy pods, where it felt like they belonged. The final pages of the book give us small hope that maybe one day, when our science advances enough, maybe we can invent an antidote and save them, put them back in each other's arms after so long. But it also ends with the tensions caused by their discovery leading to the brink of war, just as had been happening in Elia's time. In the final pages of the book, sees the students of Earth chanting in the streets against the war, just as they were doing when humanity died 900,000 years ago. Well, if you like that, like, comment, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you back here for the next one. Thanks for watching.